First of all, thanks, Aline, for the very nice introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present my research here at this lunch lecture series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my talk. And without further ado, we can dive right in. Who drives the spread of ideas? This is a very important question because if you answer it correctly, it can make you very rich. Consider the case where you want to sell a product, you can contact relevant influencers who in turn contact your relevant customer base and eventually provide you, hopefully, with a high revenue. Or you can find this question interesting because you're interested in understanding communication mechanisms during the European Reformation in the 16th century. This is what I decided to do, and I will talk about this today. So a couple of months ago, I came up with this research question because I was interested in understanding who were the influential reformers during the European Reformation. So the reformers who spread ideas and brought about this movement. Everything was in place for the analysis. I had some domain knowledge. I knew that the Reformation caused the division of the Catholic Church. Good enough for now, I thought. I had a data set consisting of about 26,000 letters written and received between about 3,000 reformers. So reformer is an umbrella term that comprises scholars, theologians, noblemen, and other important people at that time. From these data, I constructed a network, nodes representing the reformers, edges representing the letters. And I was also able to operationalize my abstract concept of being a driver for the spread of ideas. Because I'm a network scientist, I thought, hey, there is betweenness centrality, that fits very nicely, we use that. So betweenness centrality counts the number of letters a reformer A passes on from another reformer B to a third reformer C. You can see that on the right-hand side in the first graph. So we have a couple of reformers shown in green on the left who send letters to the red node in the center, and this red node passes on further letters to other nodes shown in green on the right. So the node in the center, the red node, has high betweenness centrality because it passes on the letters from the left to the right, and the peripheral nodes have low betweenness centrality. So the results of my analysis revealed that Philip Melanchthon has the highest betweenness centrality among all reformers in the network. So we can say that he is the most important driver for the spread of ideas. Well, this result is not particularly stunning, given the fact that Philip Melanchthon was very famous at that time. He was the right hand of Martin Luther, and on top of that, he lived for quite some time, so he was very productive and wrote a lot of letters. So even though these results did not shatter the current reception of the Reformation, I still thought it might be good to do some sanity checks in order to see whether I actually computed betweenness centrality correctly. And for this, I extracted little subnetworks from my large network in order to compute betweenness centrality manually there and then compare it to my computations. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see such a subnetwork consisting of 5 nodes, each corresponding to one famous reformer, like, for example, Martin Luther, shown here in the center. And in order to compute betweenness centrality, we can now track the letter connections via Luther. And as we see here, there are 4 letter connections that pass Luther. So we conclude that the betweenness centrality of Luther is 4. Great, that's the same result as the algorithm spit out. So this is correct. However, there are also sending dates of the letters shown in the top right-hand corner. So we can, for example, see that Bullinger sent a letter to Luther in 1540, and Luther then sent another letter to Melanchthon 5 years later in 1545. If we now consider the temporal ordering of these edges, so of the sending dates, and compute betweenness centrality again, then we receive a completely different result. Only one letter connection, namely the one from Bullinger to Melanchthon, is still valid because it respects the temporal ordering of the edges. Bullinger can pass his ideas onto Melanchthon via Luther because he first writes a letter in 1540, and then afterwards Luther writes another letter to Melanchthon. For the other letter connections, this is not the case. For example, if you consider the connection from Bullinger to Calvin, then Bullinger first writes a letter in 1540. However, at that point in time, Luther had already written a letter to Calvin, namely 1 year beforehand in 1539. So the ideas can't pass from Bullinger to Calvin. So in the end, we see on the right-hand side that the betweenness centrality of Luther is greatly reduced. It is just 1. So why did we get this betweenness centrality of 4 on the right-hand side? It was correct. It was the same as the computational result. This is because when we analyze aggregated networks like the one on the right-hand side without considering time, we make an implicit assumption of transitivity. This assumption means that if a node A influences another node B, this is independent of A's prior influences. And this assumption has large consequences for our analysis. We see that information can spread backwards in time if we assume transitivity. As we have seen in the bottom graph on the left-hand side, the letter connection from Bullinger to Kelvin is valid even though time runs backwards. So we see that this assumption leads to flawed network statistics in aggregated networks. This is not only a problem for my letter correspondence network, but actually for all other social networks that deal with interactions and relations. Why is that? Because human interactions and relations are inherently time-stamped. For example, you could consider communication networks, co-location networks, or trade networks. It's always the case that the temporal ordering of the edges influences the causal relationships between the nodes. So this is obviously a big problem. So how do we normally deal with that? Well, we just tend to ignore time. So we used to analyze aggregated networks where the timestamps are just thrown away. And as we have seen, this leads to wrong network statistics. We don't want that. So what could we do instead? Well, rather than analyzing aggregated networks, we could analyze paths. And there is a nice Python package called pathpy that does exactly that. And today I will present certain aspects of pathpy for historical networks with the example of my letter correspondence network of the Reformation. So before we have a look at pathpy, it might be worth getting an overview of the Reformation and the letter correspondence network. The Reformation was not only interesting because it caused the division of the Catholic Church. It's also interesting because it was one of the big transformative movements of society in our history, and that enables us to study the mechanisms of social interactions, which as a social scientist is of course very interesting. Very important for the Reformation is that letters were the main means of communication back then. And this is quite handy because all sorts of relations and topics were just discussed in one medium, namely letters. If you compare that to modern times, where we today have WhatsApp, Instagram, email, and so on, we would have to gather much more and more diverse data to capture the same amount of topics and relations. So in that case, this data set is actually quite handy. My data set is based on 9 letter editions. One letter edition refers to the letters sent and received by one important reformer. And the reformers that are covered in my data set, or the space reformers of these 9 letter editions, are shown on the right-hand side. And surely you recognize some names and faces. First and foremost, of course, Martin Luther, who started the Reformation by pinning his theses to the church wall of Wittenberg in 1517. My network consists of the nodes, of course, which correspond to reformers, and edges corresponding to letters. Very important, my underlying assumption for my analysis is that letters convey ideas. So I assume if a letter is sent from A to B, that it contains certain ideas that are then recognized by the receiver of the letter when he reads that letter. So with this overview in place, we can actually dive into pathpy. As it is very often the case, I would say always, data analysis is made up of 80% data preparation and 20% actual analysis. So let's start with the dumb task first, data preparation. Installing an importing pathpy is pretty straightforward. You can pip install it like a normal Python package and then also import it like a normal Python package. As a second step, we have to prepare the timestamps. The problem of pathpy is that it deals with Unix timestamps, which do not cover dates before January the 1st, 1970. As we deal with historical networks, most of our timestamps and dates are probably older, so we have to find a way around to address this problem. And one solution is to use time differences rather than actual dates. So what we do is we sort our dates in ascending order. So the first date is the earliest sending date of our letters. And then we compute the temporal difference between this earliest sending date with every other date in the data set. In the end, we should derive a table that looks like the one on the left-hand side with 3 columns. Each row in this table corresponds to an edge in the network. And the source column shows us the senders of the letters, here shown with IDs, but you could, of course, also use strings in order to identify the names. The target column is the same for the recipients of the letters, and the time column shows the number of days from the earliest sending date to the sending date of the letter in the current row. So we see that a time 0 corresponds to the first sending date. In my data set, that is the 1st of January, 1500. And then we see that the second letter was sent 615 days afterwards. So this is somewhere in June 1501. So this is the required input table. If you want to use pathpy, you have to prepare your data in that kind of way. Optional is dictionary to map the node index to the node name, and you can use that for visualization purposes. So because I used indices to refer to reformers in the source and target columns, they are my keys in the dictionary, and then my values are the actual names, so I know what 81 and 85 actually mean. Okay, so with our data set in place, we can actually start our first analysis, and this is computing a temporal network. A temporal network registers the interactions in our data set per time point. And in pathpy, that's super easy. It's a one-liner where your input data file is required. Then you specify your separator. Most of the time, it's a comma if you have a CSV file. And then in the end, you can specify whether your network should be directed or undirected. What is really nice is that this temporal network object provides you with summary statistics about your network. So there are basic stuff like the number of nodes and number of timestamped links, but also quite interesting stuff like the links to nodes ratio, which tells us that in this case, we have 9 times more links than nodes in our network. Moreover, we have the observation period in days, of course, because we use the time differences, but of course this could be easily converted to years. As I show here, our observation period is from 1500 to 1564. And we see that the observation length then obviously is 64 years. We also see that we have about 11,000 unique timestamps. So these are the number of unique sending dates in our data set. Then also very interesting is the average inter-event time. So the inter-event time is the time that passes between the sending of one letter and the sending of a second letter. So in our case, about 2 days pass between sending of 2 letters. And then we also see the range for the inter-event time that ranges from 1 day to about 4 years. Besides the summary statistics, the temporal network also enables us to run a dynamic visualization of the evolution of the edges, which I will show you right now. So if you can't see my browser with these little spots, please let me know. Otherwise, I assume you can see it. Okay, I assume you can see it. So you see here a frozen shot of this simulation, which I will start in a second. These little spots represent our nodes in the network, the reformers. In the top left-hand corner, you've got a timer showing you the number of days starting from 1500 and then moving on forward. The red edges show you the letters that have been sent at a certain point in time, and the gray edges show the letters that have been sent 1 year prior or 1 year after of the current time point. So you can think of it as a window looking forward or looking backward. So let's have a look what the simulation looks like. So we see that the timer has been reset to 0 and now it moves forward in days. As we can see right now, not too much is happening. Why is that? Because we are in the early days of the Reformation, so Luther hasn't even posted his theses to the wall of Wittenberg. So we need to have some patience until the network actually kicks off and we see something. So we are at the timer like 2000 days. That's about 5 years. So 1505, nothing much is happening either. I think we have to wait until 6000, then that would be about 16 years. Then we get into the range of interesting stuff happening. But we already see that edges evolve and things start to get moving. Perhaps we can move that a little bit here into the center, then we see more. And this is actually very nice to get a first grasp of how the network evolves over time, what the range is, how many letters are active at the same point in time, and so on. So we are approaching the year 1517, and we see that actually much more activity is going on already. And we also see these dominant star nodes in the centers, which refer to our 9 base reformers from these 9 letter editions. This is just how the data set is constructed. All right. Let's switch back to the presentation. Again, if you can't see my slides, tell me now, please. Otherwise, I assume you can see them. Okay, so the take-home message of this temporal network is basically that we can have nice summary statistics, and it provides it with a dynamic visualization of these temporal edges. Second, we can also compute paths with pathpy. So path is a sequence of nodes that are connected by time consecutive edges. So for example, in the top right-hand corner, you can see 4 nodes that are connected. We see that the first letter has been sent in 1530, and then 1 year later, the second letter is sent in 1531, and a third letter is sent in 1520. And because 1520 is actually before 1530, we have to cut the path here because the temporal order is broken. Paths can have different lengths. So if we have 1 single node, then this is a length of 0. Length 1 are 2 nodes connected by 1 edge. Length 2 are 3 nodes connected by 2 edges, and so on. In pathpy, it's also pretty straightforward to compute these paths. It's another one-liner where you have to input your temporal network that we just computed, and then provide a parameter called delta t, which we'll talk about on the next slide. For now, it's just important to understand that paths preserve the temporal ordering of edges. So let's have a look at this special parameter delta t. Delta t describes the maximum allowed time difference allowed between 2 consecutive edges in a path. So this is shown here in this graph. We see that the first letter has been sent on April 1st, and then the second letter has been sent on April 5th, and the third letter has been sent on the 20th of April. So although these sending dates are all in perfect chronological order, we still cut the path at the last edge because the time difference between the 5th of April and the 20th of April is too large. We assume that if there is a large time difference, then people just forget about the ideas that they received in the previous letter, so they are not able to pass them on further in their letters. So in this example, we have a delta t of 14 days. And because from the 15th of April to the 20th of April, there are 15 days, so 1 day more than these 14, we cut the path here. So again, delta t basically accounts for that people forget ideas after a long time lag. The larger the delta t we choose, the longer the obtained paths. Now that we understood what delta t does, the next question is, of course, how do we select it? Should delta t be 1 day, 1 year, 10 years, 1 week? How do we choose an appropriate value for delta t? Well, the first answer is that it depends on the data. In my data set, I chose delta t to equal the travel time plus an appropriate waiting time. So the waiting time is the time between receiving a letter and sending out a new letter, and the travel time is the time it takes from a letter to travel from its place of sending to its place of reception. Normally, we would compute the travel time by taking the date of reception minus the date of sending, but unfortunately, we don't have the receiving dates in our data set, so we have to approximate travel time in some way. And I approximated it with a walking time. So consider a letter that has been sent from Mainz to Wittenberg. Then I used the Google Maps API and computed the modern walking time. And this is my approximation of travel time. In this data set, we have a mean travel time of 35 hours. So this is a little bit more than a day. Now the question is, what would be an appropriate value for the appropriate waiting time? So the appropriate waiting time should be short enough for a reformer to remember the ideas that he received in the previous letter, but also long enough to give the reformer enough time to write the letter and to do other stuff that reformers tend to do. So I decided to choose the appropriate waiting time as 2 weeks, because research from cognitive science has shown that this is an appropriate period for you to remember important ideas. And because the travel time is very small compared to these 2 weeks, it's only a day, I chose delta t to equal 14 days, so 2 weeks. A word of caution, I only used 1% and 1% of the reformers and 24% of the links in the dataset for this analysis. Why is that? Because only these entries had both a place of sending and a place of reception for the letter, which is important to compute the walking time. So by no means are these values here representative for all the letters in the data set. So I spent quite some time in selecting this delta t and explaining to you my thoughts and my process. Why did I do that? Why did I spend so much time? Because I want you to understand that pathpy does not detect timescales for you. This is really important. We have to use our brain or theories to select delta t and really justify our choice. And this is so important because different values for delta t will lead to different results, as I will show later. But for now, we stick with our delta t of 14 days and we construct our paths according to that. Based on these paths, we can actually do some interesting analysis and come back to the initial research question, who drove the spread of ideas during the Reformation? And now we can compute betweenness centrality. We do this for the aggregated network, so where paths don't play a role, and for the actual paths. Here you see the comparisons of the betweenness centralities for the 5 highest reformers, one for the aggregated betweenness centrality and one for the path betweenness centrality. What do we see here? We see that the values for the aggregated network are much higher than for the path network, actually by an order of magnitude of 10, which is quite a lot. We also see that the ranking is actually mixed up. So although Melanchthon and Luther are still in the first places in both versions, we see that, for example, Bullinger gets into the 3rd position on the right-hand side, whereas he is in the 4th position on the left-hand side. So we see that aggregated networks overestimate betweenness centrality, but we can also conclude that Melanchthon still drives the spread of the ideas during the Reformation, however, to a smaller extent than expected from the aggregated network. All right, great. So we've answered our first research question. As there is some time left, it's time for a second one. So the first research question was about individuals who drove the spread of ideas. The second question is about mechanisms of communication. We ask here, which communication patterns were used to spread ideas? And in order to answer this research question, it's worth inspecting paths in more detail. So in this histogram, you can see the path lengths that exist in our network on the x-axis and the frequency on the y-axis. So we see how often does a path of a certain length appear in our network. And from this histogram, we see that paths of length 2 dominate, as this large bar here shows. So paths of length 2 mean that we have mediated communication. So the node in the middle is the mediator passing letters from the left to the right. The question now is, why is mediated communication so common? What's the role of these mediators? Why do we have them? And in order to address this question, we can take 2 different perspectives. One is the qualitative analysis, where we actually extract specific paths from the network and inspect the quality of the relationship between the reformers involved in this path. On the other hand, we can run a statistical analysis. This analysis asks whether the dominance of paths that we find is actually significant or just a random artifact. And what is interesting here is whether these 2 analyses actually lead to the same result, and if they don't, why that would be the case. So first things first, let's start with the qualitative inspection of paths. And here I selected the most frequent paths of length 2. The path from Albrecht via Melanchthon to Baumgartner is the most frequent path in our data set of length 2. It occurred namely 16 times. And the question now is, why did Melanchthon mediate between Albrecht and Baumgartner? Why did Albrecht not just write directly to Baumgartner? What's going on here? And we can inspect the personal relationships in this graph here below. So Albrecht was this territorial prince, and he was actually quite open-minded. He supported the Reformation, and he actually read a lot about theology, but he needed some advice. So how would you roll out the Reformation in his territory? And it was not the case that there was a binary division at that time between the Catholic and the Protestant church, but there were actually different Protestant denominations going around, and they also rejected each other. So Albrecht in the end found his advisor, namely Andreas Osiander, a professor from Königsberg, and he supported his ideas, and Osiander was actually instructed to roll out the Reformation in Albrecht's territory. However, Osiander is kind of an outsider among the reformers. He did not support the mainstream view of the Reformation, which was in turn supported by Melanchthon and Luther. So we see that some tension is going on here. However, despite this tension, we see with these gray arrows that there are still reciprocal letter connections between these three. Things look different if we go to the right-hand side of the graph. There we see Baumgartner, who was a student of Melanchthon, and again we see a reciprocal letter relationship. However, Baumgartner does not write any other letter to Albrecht or Osiander, who don't support Baumgartner's view. So there seems to be perhaps some generational gap between the old generation with the dissidents around Albrecht, Osiander, and Melanchthon, and the new generation who is more on Melanchthon's side and who seems to be much more differentiated and just writes letters among their own circle. Now you would say, well, yeah, this is just because of this particular path, but we find this pattern in other paths where Melanchthon mediates between his students and other dissidents of the older generation. These other students include Camerarius, Veit, Huberius, and Albert. And because Melanchthon mediates between these two generations that don't share their views about the Reformation, we could interpret Melanchthon to be a diplomatic mediator in this case. Let's have a look at another path of length 2 that is actually the most frequent path, the second most frequent path, occurring 15 times in the data set, and it is between Oecolampad, Zwingli, and Vadian. These are all Swiss reformers. Oecolampad worked in Basel, Zwingli in Zurich, and Vadian in St. Gallen. And again, the question is, why did Zwingli mediate this path? What is going on here? So we see reciprocal relationships regarding the letter correspondence between Oecolampad and Zwingli and Vadian. However, there is only a unidirectional relationship regarding letter correspondence between Oecolampad and Vadian, although all of them supported the same version of the Reformation. So they were not friends, but at least they didn't fight against each other. So the question is, okay, Oecolampad seems to be interested in Vadian. He sends him letters, but why does Vadian not reply? And this might be because in St. Gallen, where Vadian worked, the Catholic forces were quite powerful. They had a big monastery, and for the reformers there, it might have been much harder to put into practice the ideas of the Reformation because the Catholic forces were so strong. So what Vadian was probably very busy and had to prioritize his receivers, and it was handy for him that there was Zwingli who would always pass on his ideas to other people. And we again see that this is not a single case, but in all paths that are mediated by Zwingli and where the final piece is Vadian, Vadian does not reply to the original sender in 66% of the cases. So quite a high number. So we can interpret Zwingli to be here a helpful mediator who helps busy Vadian to circumvent the choice that he has to make between all his receivers. So we've done the qualitative analysis. Let's have a look at the statistical inspection of paths. So here we want to see whether paths that we extract of a certain length are actually significant for the information flow or whether they are just random artifacts. So what does it mean for a path to be significant or random? This is shown here in these two graphs. We have a path of length 2 between the nodes A, B, and C. On the left-hand side, we see a significant path because A and C mainly communicate indirectly, whereas only sometimes directly. So paths of length 2 are much more dominant compared to the direct relationship. With a random path, the relationship is reversed. This time, A and C mainly communicate directly and only sometimes indirectly. And we can perform a statistical analysis in order to find out whether paths of a certain length are actually significant or random. And in order to do that, to run these statistical tests, we have to build two new models. The first one is the higher order network model, and the second one is the multi-order network model. So let's start with the higher order network model first. Higher order just means more complex than dyadic relationships. So dyadic relationships are the ones found in aggregated networks where each node corresponds to one reformer. However, in higher order network models, nodes don't correspond to single reformers, but to paths of a specific length. This is shown in the first row on the right-hand side. So we have an aggregated network, each node is a reformer, and then to the right, we have a higher order network where each node represents a path of length 1. So these are pairs of reformers. Now, if we want to test whether a path of a specific length is significant, we first have to randomize our paths in the network. What does that mean? It means that we first remove the timestamps from the network and then construct new paths. And because we don't have any timestamps, the new paths allow time to run backwards. This is meant by randomizing paths. In the first row on the right-hand side, on the very right, you can see such a randomization of paths. So this is again a higher order network model, but compared to the observed network model here in the center, we have an additional edge. So if you consider the higher order network model in the center, we have a missing edge between the node Butzer-Luther to Luther-Melanchthon, this one here. However, this edge is actually present in the randomized version here, Butzer-Luther to Luther-Melanchthon. And this is the case because in the observed version, paths depend on time. So we see that this path here is not valid. However, for the randomized version, time doesn't play a role, so we are allowed to add this path. And what the statistical test now does is it compares this observed network here with this randomized network here. And if these two differ, then we can infer that the observed paths are actually significant. Now, the problem with this statistical test is that it is really cumbersome because for every path length, we would have to construct these randomized paths and then compare them to the observed ones. So there is a nice way around with the multi-order network model. And this multi-order network model basically is a layered network where each layer corresponds to another higher order network model, and each higher order network model represents another path length. So consider the second row here on the right-hand side. We have an aggregated network, and the difference between this aggregated network with this aggregated network here is that we added an additional edge here from Melanchthon to Butzer, which provides us with a path of a longer length. And then we can construct another higher order network model where nodes are now triplets of reformers. And in the multi-order network model, we would stack this higher order network model here, where nodes represent pairs of reformers, and this higher order network model here, where nodes represent triplets of reformers. And in the end, this multi-order network model tells us which path length is actually significant and explains our communication mechanisms best. All right, this is just a slide for reference. It shows you how to implement these things. Let me show you by highlighting. So this first paragraph here is about the multi-order network model. Again, a one-liner to compute the multi-order network model. We put our path object here as parameter, and then this parameter here, max order, tells us until which path length we should actually build our multi-order network model. In this line, we perform a maximum likelihood estimation, telling us which path length is the significant one in the network. And then in the second paragraph, we actually perform our statistical test manually with the higher order network models. So first paragraph, fast version, second paragraph, long version, if you are interested in the nitty bits and pieces. All right. So I ran this multi-order network model, and it revealed that the significant path length is actually 2 in our network. So that means that one-hop mediated communication is the main communication pattern for the spread of ideas during the Reformation. Well, that's great because that actually matches our qualitative results quite nicely, where we also saw that the dominant path length is 2. However, there is reason for caution because the qualitative and the statistical results don't always match. And they don't always match because in the qualitative analysis, we didn't consider subpaths. So consider a path of length 2. It of course also contains path of length 1. And if we just count the unique paths of length 1, or the subpaths are not considered, so the histograms look differently. We have to think of that. Another reason of caution is how our results vary with delta t. Does a variation of delta t actually leads to robust results or not? And this robustness check is shown on the right-hand side, where I plotted the histograms of path frequencies for the different path lengths for different values of delta t. So we have here one histogram where delta t is 7, here 10 days, 14 days, this is our analysis, and here 20 days. Now what we see when we compare these histograms is that for all of them, paths of length 2 are super dominant. These high bars are all corresponding to paths of length 2. This shows us that we have done a good robustness checks for our qualitative analysis. However, for the statistical analysis, robustness is broken down because if we run our higher order model and the multi-order model, we see that actually the significant path length for small delta t's is 1 and not 2 anymore. So there is no mediated communication, there is just dyadic communication as the significant communication pattern in the network. However, a significant path length of 2 is obtained when we increase delta t. So what this shows is that it's really important to justify why you chose a certain value of delta t rather than trying out different ones and then picking the one that matches your results. It should be the other way around, and this hopefully shows you why this is so important. All right, so I've talked a lot about specific functionalities of pathpy, and now I think it's time to go to a more meta level and inspect pathpy from higher order perspective to be in terms of pathpy. And this is so important because pathpy was not particularly designed for historical networks, but in general for temporal networks. So let's see whether it's actually useful to use it for historical temporal networks, which face other challenges than other network types. So let's start with the scope first. We have seen that we can use pathpy for the evolution or to plot the evolution of a network by these dynamic visualization of the formation of edges, which is of course very nice. We've also seen that pathpy leads to accurate topological network measures because paths account for temporal orderings of the edges. So I've shown that with the example of betweenness centrality, but of course it accounts for other centrality measures and also for community detection. Third, we have seen that we can detect significant communication patterns with pathpy by using statistical tests with the higher and multi-order network models. And last, I haven't even touched on that, but pathpy provides you with a great suite of dynamic and static network visualizations ranging from alluvial diagrams over diffusion simulations and directed acyclic graphs. So if your analysis scope matches one of these aims, great, then you can use pathpy. However, there are of course also limitations. The first limitation of pathpy is that it assumes the preserved quantity. What does that mean? It means that ideas are conveyed in letters and remain fixed. So if you have a letter, then each letter conveys different ideas, but the paths only depend on the timestamps of the letters, but not on these ideas that are actually moved on. So in this graph here, we see that the first two letters convey the green and the yellow idea, but the third letter conveys completely different ideas, namely the blue, pink, and gray one. So it would make sense that we cut the path here because completely different things are conveyed. If I talk about the Schmalkaldic War in the beginning and then about cooking recipes, there is no passage of ideas. It's just something completely different. But pathpy ignores that because it's only about timestamps and not about topics. Second limitation is the constant timescale assumption. So we set one value for delta t, which is valid for the complete observation period. However, delta t is obviously likely to vary with other factors like geography. So paths are probably different between major cities compared to the countryside, or between people because they have different mechanisms of writing letters, or between historical periods. During wartime, the letter mechanisms are different because travel is impeded compared to peace times. So this is not possible currently in pathpy, which is a limitation, I would say. The third point is the no timescale detection, which we touched upon when we discussed delta t. I wouldn't say that this is a limitation. It's actually a nice thing that we have to think about choosing delta t. However, I think it's causing quite an effort to think about the right choice of delta t. And because this is so cumbersome, I put it under limitations here. The last limitation is the randomization of path because it is restricted to network data. We remind ourselves that this randomization was necessary for the statistical analysis in order to infer whether paths are significant or random. And this randomization is only based on network data, meaning that it only considers the timestamps of the edges. In the end, randomization is nothing else than computing a probability for the existence of a path. But the probabilities don't only depend on timestamps, but probably also on the geographic period, on the people involved, on the historical period. So we could include other external data sets to compute this randomization, but it is not possible at the moment. So to conclude, I think it's great to use pathpy if you want to address the problem of ignoring time in networks. However, it's also important to note that pathpy is not domain specific and it is restricted to network data, and historical network analyses require perhaps other means as well. So I've talked a lot about functionalities of pathpy, but because this is the lunch lecture series of the historical network research community, I think it might be good also to give an historical overview of pathpy. So the origin of pathpy is at the Chair of Systems Design, my current research group, where Professor Frank Schweitzer is the professor. And it was developed there by a senior scientist called Ingo Scholtes. And most of the things that I presented in this talk are actually based on Ingo's work, so they don't come from my own brain, to give credit to Ingo. Ingo has a nice website of pathpy with some videos, some coding tutorials, and also important papers explaining the math and science behind pathpy. So if you're interested in that, that's a great place to look for further resources. And with that, I'm almost at the end of my presentation, so it's time for a summary. I've started this whole talk with the motivation that time matters in networks. Why does time matter? Because social networks are based on interactions and relations, and they are inherently time-stamped, and therefore the edges are temporally ordered. We have seen that aggregated networks ignore time, and as a consequence, time can run backwards, which leads to wrong network measures, which is of course bad. I've introduced pathpy as a Python package, which accounts for the temporal ordering of edges. We are able to compute accurate topological network measures with pathpy, show dynamic visualizations, and also run statistical inferences. With the example of the Reformation, I've shown how to use pathpy for a letter correspondence network. We have seen that Melanchthon was the main driver for the spread of ideas, and we've also seen that one-hop mediated communication is the dominant communication pattern in the network, and we've also found explanatory mechanisms why this is the case. And with that, I hope that you are now all very fan of including temporal analyses in your networks or in your, with your networks, and hope to use pathpy in the future. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions now.